So I'm going to see how this can go. We should have talked about functionalism and all that the school of functionalists, such as John Dewey, was the last one we talked about. So I want to get into these other perspectives. So behaviorism is one of the biggest ones that we're going to talk about. Behaviorism is going to kind of float through many of the other ones. It's also with the psychodynamic, which we're going to get to in just a second. So, when we talk about behaviorism, we need to talk about a guy named John Watson. And John Watson was kind of the godfather of behaviorists. He was one of the earliest behaviorists who said, like the functionalists and structuralists, he didn't really care about what people said or what they felt, because if you are self-reporting what you feel or what you're thinking, um, maybe you don't even really know yourself, or maybe you're not really being honest, or maybe you're trying to hide something and you don't even know it. So John Watson only wanted to look at observable behavior. And he did this probably not very ethically, but he did this with a little boy named Baby Albert. And this is Baby Albert right here. Now, Baby Albert was an orphan. John Watson, and this is John Watson's nurse right here. John Watson and his nurse performed many, many experimentations on Baby Albert in the name of psychology to really see behavior, and actually not only see how people behave, but to try to manipulate and change it, and um, change people's behavior. So what Watson would do, and I'm not sure if you can see this here, but there's a little rabbit there with Baby Albert. And what Watson did is, Baby Albert is about 10 months or so right here. And he took Baby Albert and he introduced him to this bunny, which this might have been one of the earlier pictures. And Baby Albert's like, oh, like he doesn't really know what to think, but he's kind of warming up to this rabbit. Well, Baby Albert came to understand that this bunny was soft and this bunny was, very serene, and he enjoyed this, petting this bunny. The bunny wasn't harming him, and he came to like this bunny. Well, Watson did this time after time. He would bring Baby Albert out, bring the bunny out, watch him interact, so on and so forth. So he got this kind of baseline data. Then he changed it, and this is where he manipulates it. When John Watson would bring out the bunny to Baby Albert, shortly after, almost immediately after, he would make a loud noise and he would bang something really loud. And now look at what Baby Albert's reaction is. He's scared. He's really upset because babies don't like to be startled like that. Well, Watson would do this time after time after time, and that pairing together of the baby and this loud noise shocked him, scared Baby Albert. And then actually Watson went back and undid kind of what he manipulated into him being scared. And this is really the beginning of behaviorism. We know some things about Baby Albert, and please ask questions tomorrow when we're in class together. But we know that this Baby Albert was really manipulated as an orphan child in the name of science, but not ethically. Was John Watson performing this experimentation? Along came B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner was in the 1950s and 60s, and he studied the same kind of conditioning. How can I get people to do what I want? How can I get myself to do what I want through conditioning, through manipulation, through ways of thinking, to then act on it? And that consequences shape behavior. I have that sign. You are, free to choose, but you are not free from the consequences of your choice. And this is what Skinner, well, how do you get people to make a different choice? Because they're still going to have the consequence. This is part of the behaviorist idea. There's Skinner right there. He's got awesome hairdo. He is the leading behaviorist. In fact, through much of the 1950s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s, it is like B.F. Skinner is the behaviorist of the day. So there's some other perspective. The psychodynamic perspective. It began as what we call the psychoanalytic perspective, and this is Sigmund Freud. Now, if there's one name that you associate with psychology, is probably Freud, because Freudian theory is huge. Now, there's pretty much every bit of Freudian theory that's been debunked. But there's a reason we still talk about him. The reason we still talk about Sigmund Freud is because he's like the OG. He's like the original gangsta. You know, he started it. The things that he said and brought up were, I mean, today even, we're like, oh no, Freud, what are you saying? But he is the one who changed psychology as we know it today. He kind of was like a behaviorist, but he believed our unconscious thoughts, and that's the word I want you to underline. When I talk about some of these, like for Watson, that I want you to underline observable behavior and manipulation and change. I want you to look at that. For Freud, he looked at the unconscious mind. What you might do, like a behavior, what a behavior you might do, and you don't even really know why you're doing it or what's going on. You might not even really think about it. This is how he said we are very motivated in psychology to do and say the things we do. And it comes through our childhood experiences, oftentimes traumatic childhood experiences. So be careful not to switch up behaviorism and psychodynamic. And so when you think about psychodynamic, I want you to underline unconscious thoughts, childhood experiences, and kind of like the sexual overtones. Now, some of the work that we're going to do in the handout in the practice tomorrow won't have a lot of those sexual overtones, but you will understand like these dreams. Freud wrote probably one of the most legendary books on the psychology of dreams, and he would analyze dreams and what they mean, and he would look for these sexual overtones. And this is really why people have debunked Freud. He went too far. Freud lived in the turn of the century, about the 1900s, in Europe. He was a Jewish man, and a lot of what we think we know about Freud now, we look at actually his own childhood and the way he was raised and what he maybe went through himself, the reason why he changed his perspective. So there's kind of what the perfect Freudian psychologist would be. You know, if you've seen in TV or movies, there's a psychologist sitting there and the patient is there laying on the couch, and the the psychologist is just sitting there, yeah, yeah, like barely even listening. But then the patient might say something, and Freud would be like, oh wait, what, let's talk about that. He'll hear a key word. So kind of this free association where all of a sudden, let's just talk about this word, and then what comes to mind when you think about that. This is what Freud did. And actually a little story about the couch. So two stories in one. Freud is a doctor. He started out as a medical doctor, and he had a woman who came in complaining of stomach pains over and over and over. And in what he could do in medicine at the time, he couldn't figure out anything that was wrong with her. Like digestive problems, he couldn't figure out. She didn't have any issues that Freud could see. But every time she came into his office, she'd talk to him, and then she would go home, and it seemed like she felt better. Well, she did this, and then she'd come back a few days later and be like, oh, my symptoms are back, doctor. And he realized that this woman didn't have these nondescript, like, stomach issues, digestive problems. She was anxious, and she had probably depression and these issues that she needed to talk about. And when she came into his office, she felt better talking about them. And so it was probably not the same woman, but the story goes that there was a patient who was so grateful for what Freud did that they brought him this beautiful piece of furniture, like this incredible chaise lounge. And he put it in his office. And this is where we get the idea of the patient laying on kind of the couch, if you will, and the doctor sitting there taking notes, barely listening, but trying to get the patient to just talk and talk and talk and have some kind of thought unconsciously come out through this conversation that they're really kind of only having with themselves. The humanistic theory. This is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. We'll talk a lot about that in coming chapters. Two words I want you to underline here: growth and potential. So, what Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers both did is they said, people have this amazing capacity to, take those hard hits in life, deal with the really bad stuff, and then come out of it and realize I can get like better and I can work at this, and you kind of get to this higher level. This is a lot what we in teaching try to do. We try to get you to reach this higher level of thinking, of learning, of being, really, in the Catholic tradition. We want you to reach heaven. That's what we're all working for. And in the humanistic theory, Rogers and Maslow said people can do that. People are pretty great, and they can get to those higher levels by thinking and reflecting on what they are and where they came from. They rejected the idea of simply being behaviorists because they said it was just instinctual. Think back to Watson. When baby Albert was startled by that, that was behavior. That was because human nature has said you have to be startled by a loud noise in order to self-preserve and not get like clubbed over the back of the head by somebody trying to take your piece of meat or something. And so they said that was just instinctual. That's not reaching a higher level, because humans have that capacity as human beings. This is a lot of that aha moment, like Gru, like light bulb, where you just kind of, you get it, and maybe you have had this yet, and maybe you haven't, but there'll be a time, I promise, there'll be a time when there'll be something in your life that all of a sudden, just, you have clarity, you kind of get it. And that's really the humanistic perspective. You think a lot inward, the self, reflecting, and maybe you should put that word too, self and concept, self-reflecting. That's a good understanding of the humanistic theory. The cognitive. I say cognitive, you should say thinking. I say cognition, you should say think. Anytime you hear the word cognitive or cognition, you should immediately come to mind the word thinking. The mind, and remembering and retaining and understanding. This is, and the cognitive perspective is really the booming perspective right now in psychology, where we want people to think about, why did you make that action? What are you kind of doing right now with whatever it happens to be going on in your life? This is a bit like in the Catholic tradition of a homily, or really any tradition of a sermon or a homily. The priest will say, give you some light and give you something to think about, and then you go home, and for the next week or however many days, you kind of think about in your own life, where do I fit into this, and how does that affect me? So anything about remembering or retaining information. How do you retain information? How does that information come in and then come back out? Understanding, thinking, helps understand our mental activity and disorders. We'll talk a lot about disorders in later chapters. By the way, any questions that you have, make sure you're writing these down so we can talk about these in class. There's Rodin, the thinker, the real self-reflective kind of idea. All right, the biological perspective. This searches for causes of behavior in the functioning of genes. So anything that has to do with the brain, the nervous system, the endocrine system, blood, Any anatomy and physiology, if it has to do with that, at its most basic level, that is from the biological perspective. Um, you know, like how if there's a chemical going on in your brain, how is that making your body do things? You know, that might be the behavior, that observable behavior, but is it because of a mind altering substance or something? This is the biological perspective. There's our neuron. Our next chapter is going to be on biology, and this is the basic building block. So the biology perspective looks at all those things in the genes, in the brain, in our entire body system. The evolutionary perspective. This is Charles Darwin's, theory of natural selection, that mental abilities aid in successful adaptation. Um, think about back in the behaviorists in what Watson did. If baby um, Albert couldn't have responded with the cry in the being upset from the loud noise, then humans cannot get better and adapt over time. And so the evolutionary perspective is working on not only years but millennium of human existence and how we successfully become humans. Now, there's not a lot of evolutionary psychologists because you really can't carry out experiments or really have track any data because the evolutionary process takes such an extremely long time. You can look at older examples of what people did from thousands of years ago and kind of understand they ate this, they lived here, they might have done worshipped in this way, but that's only from thousands of years ago or even hundreds of years ago. You can look at something today, but you don't have any evolutionary process happening. That's quite the cartoon there. You are, the walking on all fours and you're bipedal, you're walking upright, and there you're, still carrying probably your club in the next one, and then you're all actually pretty high on the food chain, if you will, evolution wise, carrying the briefcase, talking on the cell phone, and then it looks like we're starting to revert and we're looking down again at the cell phone. So I think about that when you're walking along, trying to send a text as you walk. Are we regressing to an earlier time? The sociocultural perspective. This is looking at society, depending in our culture, how that shapes how we think, how we act, what we do, and what we say. So, for instance, the kinds of foods you eat, the traditions you follow. Is it because of where you grew up? Is it because that's what you like to do? Chances are it would be because of how you were raised. I um, If you like to eat pancakes on Sunday, is that because your family did that as a tradition? If you the tradition of the 15-year-olds in the Hispanic tradition, it's a birthday for 15-year-olds, kind of as a rite of passage. That's a very socio-cultural perspective, and that behavior then is reflected and changes how you think as well. So there are also many subfields of psychology: educational psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology. I know there's a lot of students taking child psychology in college. So there's other subfields of psychology that would probably be based on one of the perspectives. More than likely, the cognitive perspective, maybe the sociocultural perspective, just kind of depends. Psychologists are often counselors or clinicians and usually require a master's degree. We're going to talk more about some of the requirements of a psychologist in the field in the workplace, but right now I just wanted to get through these perspectives. So think about the humanistic. Let's start with the behaviors. Thinking, uh, the behaviorist, acting, behaving, the cognitive psychologist, the thinking, the psychodynamic psychologist, childhood, and the unconscious, and even dreams as well. The sociocultural, where the culture is been influencing their world, music or fashion or whatever it happens to be. The humanist, where you have this great potential for growth, like you're 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 going to be great, and somebody is telling you, you know what, you're doing great, like I'm really proud of you, and even if you like screwed up, like that's really great. um am I missing any? I don't think I am. So that is it for this, and we will work on the perspectives tomorrow then.